Hey guys, this is Sujay Suvarna, and in this video series, I'm going to cover the book Indian Polity by Lakshmikant as lucidly as possible. So, let me take 30 seconds to explain the format of the video series before we get started with the first chapter. I'm going to try and simplify these chapters as succinctly and make them as visually pleasing as possible. The whole idea of the series is going to be to make studying Indian Polity by Lakshmikant a joyful experience. I'm not going to call these videos lectures because my goal is to use as many graphics, animations, visual elements to keep things quirky and interesting. Also, I know people will ask me if they can have these videos in form of notes. So after looking at the response, I might put up the transcripts of these videos online if you all need it. But remember that I will cover all the chapters from end to end without missing a single word. So you can refer to these videos for revision as well. The British came to India in 1600 as traders in the form of East India Company, with an exclusive right to trade in India under a charter granted by Queen Elizabeth I. Queen Elizabeth I had basically granted a charter to East India Company which effectively gave them the right to trade in India. But since the charter was given by the Queen, it was also referred to as the Royal Charter. So till the year 1765, the East India Company had purely trading functions, and the company obtained Diwani, that is rights over revenue and civil justice of Bengal, Bihar and Orissa. And this very Diwani right started its career as a territorial power in India. So let's step away from the book for a second and understand the backstory of Diwani rights here. When the East India Company had come to India in the 1600s, India had a huge share in the global GDP at the time. So much that our country was also known as Sone Ki Chidiya during that time. Trading in such a lucrative era made the East India Company extremely wealthy, and they amassed significant political and military influence over time. But East India Company's big day came in the year 1764. That's when the company fought in the Battle of Buxar, the war that was fought in 1764, and the British won that war. The East India Company won that war. This victory changed the company's fortunes. Because of this victory, the company obtained Diwani rights, and this took them to a whole different level. So how exactly did Diwani rights change things for the East India Company compared to the kind of power they had for the last 160 or more years before that? Pay attention to this. Diwani rights gave the East India Company the rights over revenue and civil justice. But earlier, they just had the right to trade. So in effect, this made them much more powerful. So with the kind of power and authority that the East India Company had, one would naturally assume that the East India Company would become much more richer and wealthier, but no, that did not happen. What happened was that the East India Company's officials and bureaucrats got richer instead. The corruption of the officials affected the revenues of the company so much that the company ran into a huge debt of almost £1 million. So, to mitigate this debt crisis, the East India Company approached the British government, and this pissed the British government off to no end. The government went like, what the hell? We have sent these guys to earn more profits and tax revenues for us, but instead they have run the company into the ground and put us in debt. Which is why the angry and the annoyed British government decided to cut the company to size and imposed or enacted a set of laws in the British Parliament to control and regulate the affairs of the East India Company. So from the period of 1773 to 1858, the British rule in India was referred to as the company rule by many historians. Also, one thing that you should all keep in mind is that the laws and regulations during the company rule were revised every 20 years. Like the first act was enacted in 1773, followed by the one in 1793, and then 1813, and so on and so forth. Obviously, a couple of smaller acts came in between as well, but for the sake of overview understanding, just remember the idea of every 20 years. Before getting into the nuances of all the regulations during the company rule, let's touch upon the basic premise and understand why the company lasted from 1773 to 1853. And we will also try to understand the demarcation between the company rule and the crown rule. So as we discussed, the regulating acts starting from 1773 onwards were brought about to control the affairs of the East India Company. But by 1857, the company had troubled the native Indians and native Indian sepoys so much that there was a sepoy mutiny in 1857. Yes, I'm talking about the famous 1857 revolt, which led to thousands of Indian sepoys revolting against the company. Following the revolt, the British Crown abolished the East India Company for good, and the British started administering India directly. The rule that followed was known as the Crown Rule. Now that the distinction between the Company Rule and the Crown Rule is clear, let's get back to the book and understand the Regulating Act of 1773. So remember this very important point. After the Battle of Buxar, the East India Company had become a very powerful entity, very powerful political entity with powers to administer and collect tax revenues and whatnot. Therefore, in order to control and regulate the company, the British government brought about a law called the Regulating Act of 1773. Do remember that this act was of great constitutional importance, as A, it was the first step taken by the British government to control and regulate the affairs of the East India Company in India. B, it recognized for the first time the political and administrative functions of the company. Why do I stress on the fact that it was the first time for all these steps? Earlier, the East India Company used to basically govern and administer the country however it felt like. And now, they had lost that absolute control that they used to have. The Regulating Act of 1773 also laid the foundations of central administration in India. What do we mean by foundations for centralized administration? So during that time, India had three zones or seats of power, namely Bengal, Madras, and these three presidencies had their own governors, their own legislatures, and their own executives. Moreover, all the three presidencies were independent of one another. So now with this act, the governor of Bengal got a big powerful promotion and became the Governor General of Bengal. And it also made the governors of Bombay and Madras presidencies subordinate to the Governor General of Bengal. The governors of Bombay and Madras, who had so much independence and power earlier, would have been so upset, right? Anyway, going forward, who was the first Governor General of Bengal? Look at the book. It was Lord Warren Hastings. So could the Governor General of Bengal do all the tasks by himself after having such an enormous jurisdiction? No, right? That's why the Regulating Act of 1773 provided for an executive council of 4 members to assist him. This one bit about the executive council that I'm going to mention isn't really mentioned in the book, but it was colloquially also referred to as the Calcutta Council and sometimes as the Council of 4. Something along the lines of monikers like the Lutyens Media or the Khan Market gang that we see in Delhi today. The Regulating Act of 1773 also provided for the establishment of a Supreme Court at Calcutta, which was set up in 1774. It comprised of 1 Chief Justice and 3 other judges. Please note that this Supreme Court, is not the same as the Supreme Court that we have in our country today. Many people get confused about this, so please keep this in mind. The Act also prohibited the servants of the company from engaging in any private trade or accepting presents or bribes from the natives. This was a big bummer for the officials because they were so used to being corrupt and demanding bribes and gifts from us Indians on a daily basis. To be honest, this didn't do much to stop the corruption, just that it wasn't as open as it was earlier. The Act also strengthened the control of the British government over the company by requiring the Court of Directors, which was essentially the governing body of the company, to report on its revenue, civil and military affairs in India. So when we say that the British government wanted to regulate the East India Company, what we mean is that the British government wanted answerability and accountability. And who was accountable to whom? The Court of Directors of the East India Company in effect were answerable to the British government. Basically, the Regulating Act of 1773 was the first step to put checks and balances in place against the East India Company. The Amending Act of 1781, which was also known as the Act of Settlement, was passed by the British Parliament in 1781 to remove the defects of the Regulating Act of 1773. It is also known as Declaratory Act of 1781. The key provision of this act was to demarcate the relations between the Supreme Court and the Governor General in Council. This act isn't clearly mentioned or explained in the book, but I've seen many questions pertaining to this topic in several test series, so I'll just go ahead and explain this in detail to you all. One of the biggest problems created by the Regulating Act of 1773 was the tussle between the Supreme Court and the Governor General in Council. Both the bodies used to fight with each other over their jurisdiction. In fact, this is one of the problems that we witness in our country to this day. Yes, I'm talking about the separation of powers of the executive from the judiciary. So this Amendment Act basically curtailed powers of the Supreme Court and gave more powers to the Governor General in Council. How? Under the Regulating Act of 1773, the servants of the company came within the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, and this brought them under the dual control of the Governor General in Council and the Supreme Court. The 1781 amendment exempted the actions of the public servants in their company in their official capacity from the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. The Act also exempted revenue collectors, including zamindars as well as the judicial officers of the company, from the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. Basically, it allowed all the officials to behave lawlessly without caring much about the Supreme Court, as long as they were in the good books of the Governor General in Council. The Supreme Court's geographic jurisdiction became limited to only Calcutta. So keep this in mind. The so-called Supreme Court's jurisdiction did not extend to the whole of India, or even Bengal for that matter. It was just Calcutta at the time. The Act also asserted that Muslim cases should be determined by Mohammedan law and Hindu law should be applied in Hindu cases. This is a very important factoid to remember. Which act was it that segregated laws on communal lines? It was the Amending Act of 1781. The Act laid down that the appeals from the provincial courts could be taken to the Governor General in Council only and not to the Supreme Court. The more you read this act, the more you feel like the so-called Supreme Court was a token court. Don't you? The act also empowered the Governor General in Council to frame regulations for the provincial courts and the councils. The above discussion makes it very clear and evident that the Amending Act of 1781 was the first attempt in India towards the separation of the executive from the judiciary by defining the respective areas of jurisdiction, and that the powers were very, very biased towards the executive. So anyway, moving on to the Pitts India Act of 1784, let's try and look at the premise of this whole thing. So the Regulating Act of 1773 and also the Settlement Act of 1781 were not really successful because the officials of the East India Company had gotten so used to the kind of power that they had for the last 150, 175 years. It was obvious that they were not going to be okay with letting go of the kind of power and clout that they had, which is why they were not cooperating with the government and they were not coming to terms with the idea of being regulated. So to fix the shortcomings of the Regulating Act of 1773 and to see to it that the company officials follow the given orders, William Pitt, the Prime Minister of the British government at the time, introduced the Pitts India Act of 1784. So with the Pitts India Act, Indian affairs came directly under the control of the British government in Britain. And like I said earlier, it basically demarcated and distinguished between the commercial and political functions of the company. So when I say they demarcated and distinguished between the commercial and political functions of the company, what I mean is that they had two bodies. One was the Court of Directors and another one was the Board of Control. It resulted in dual control or joint government in India by the Crown in Great Britain and the British East Indian Company, with the Crown having the ultimate authority. The Court of Directors had powers over the commercial affairs of the company. They were more like the Corporate Affairs Ministry, to put it in simple words. And the Board of Control, on the other hand, had more political powers to supervise and direct all operations of the civil and military government, or to manage the revenues of the British possessions in India. Like, for example, we could call it the Home Ministry or the Defense Ministry because of the powers that they had. This is just a verbal explanation for your understanding. Don't take it literally, but I'm just trying to make a point here. So in effect, the Court of Directors was controlled by the East India Company, and the Board of Control was controlled by the government, which was run by the British Parliament. So for the first time, and pay attention to this, for the first time, the company's territories in India started being referred to as the British possessions in India. And moreover, the British government was given the supreme control over the company's affairs and its administration in India. Thus, it was becoming more and more evident that the East India Company was slowly getting reduced to a simple managerial body. The East India Company was no more a powerful body with the kind of control that it used to have over its territories earlier. What a bummer for them, huh? So right after the Pitt's India Act of 1784, there were some minor acts like the Act of 1786 and the Charter Act of 1793 that were not so significant, but for the sake of our syllabus, we'll cover them. So right after the Pitt's India Act of 1784, there were some minor acts like the Act of 1786 and the Charter Act of 1793 that were not so significant, but for the sake of our syllabus, we'll cover them. So in 1786, Lord Cornwallis was appointed as the Governor General of Bengal. And this man was so eccentric and so arrogant that he placed two demands to accept that post. The first one being that he should be given the power to override the decision of his council in special cases. He would also be the commander-in-chief. I repeat, the commander-in-chief. That means he did not just want to head the civilian government of British India, but he also wanted to head the military. He also wanted to be the supreme commander of the British Indian Army. So to accommodate these demands of Lord Cornwallis, the Act of 1786 was enacted. So before going from the Act of 1786 to the Charter Act of 1793, I want you guys to critically analyze one thing and understand that the demands that were put forth by Lord Cornwallis proved to be working to some extent. What demands are we talking about? Demands like giving overriding powers to the Governor General. The centralization of power was working in the favor of the British government. So looking at the success of the centralization of power with the Governor General of Bengal, the Charter Act of 1793 focused more on increasing the powers given to the Governor General. Number one, it extended the overriding powers given to Lord Cornwallis over his council, and the same courtesy was extended to all the future Governor Generals and Governors of Presidencies. And then it gave the Governor General more powers to control the governments of subordinate presidencies of Bombay and Madras than the Governor General already had. Can you imagine the fate of those governors of Bombay and Madras presidencies? What would they have felt? So I hope you're being able to understand the gradual progression in the centralization of power. The Charter Act of 1793 also extended the trade monopoly of the company in India for another period of 20 years. So earlier it was from 1773 to 1793, and now it was from 1793 to 1813. This act also provided that the Commander-in-Chief, who, as we discussed earlier, was the Supreme Commander of the British Indian Army also at the time, would not be a member of the Governor General's Council unless he was specifically appointed to be a part of the Council. And the last provision of the Charter Act of 1793 was that it laid down that the members of the Board of Control and their entire staff would henceforth be paid out of the Indian revenues. And this, in my personal estimate, was the most annoying aspect of this act. So don't forget, which act was it that allowed the Board of Control and the staff to be paid from the Indian coffers? It was the Charter Act of 1793. So what is that one big thing that happened in the Charter Act of 1813? The East India Company that enjoyed trade and monopoly for over 200 years, from almost 1600s all the way until 1813, the British government clipped their wings. The British government just ended or abolished the monopoly of the East India Company in almost every trading sector in India. They left them with the monopoly to trade in tea and to trade with China. So except for tea and trading with China, trading in all the commodities was thrown open to all British subjects. And moreover, this also lasted only till 1833. That's when the next Charter Act came out. So in 1833, the British government abolished the trade of the company altogether. So by 1833, what little power they had left was also gone. The Charter Act of 1813 also asserted the sovereignty of British Crown over companies' territories in India. That means the constitutional position of territories in India was explicitly defined for the first time. What I mean is that from the time of Pitt's India Act of 1784 up until Charter Act of 1813, the British government were just calling their territories British India possessions. And the terminology was not explicitly defined earlier. So there was no real constitutional position. But after Charter Act of 1813 that changed. So things were not vague or ambiguous anymore. It was established that whatever territories the East India Company had all this while, which was later called the British possession in India, now belonged to the British Crown officially. The Charter Act of 1813 also allowed the Christian missionaries to come to India, and it also provided for the spread of Western education amongst the inhabitants of British territories in India. So the British government had set aside 1 lakh rupees for the spread of Western education in native India. A point to be noted here is that though the entire budget of British India during that time was rupees 5 lakhs, the government had set aside 1 lakh rupees for the spread of Western education. That means they had set aside 2% of the GDP to just spread Western education. And it was the Charter Act of 1813 that led to Anglicization of the education system in India that we witness today. The Charter Act of 1813 also authorized the local governments in India to impose taxes on people. And if the people did not pay these taxes, the local government had the power to punish them. Pay attention, I'm not talking about the state government or the central government. The local government is your municipality or your local panchayat. And this law for the local government to be able to impose taxes and punish them for not paying up came through because of the Charter Act of 1813. The Charter Act of 1833 was also known as the St. Helena Act. So this act was the final step towards centralization in British India. I repeat, the final step towards centralization. How, you ask? So let's just examine the magnification of powers of the Governor General of Bengal here. First, under the Regulating Act of 1773, Madras and Bombay presidencies were made subordinate to Bengal, correct? And then under Charter Act of 1793, the Governor General of Bengal became even more powerful because the governors of Madras and Bombay became even more subordinate to him than they already were. But under the Charter Act of 1833, the Governor General of Bengal became the Governor General of India. Imagine this, the Governor General of the entire country. The Governor General of India had all the civil and military powers, and therefore this act for the first time ever led to the creation of Government of India. The government that had authority over the entire territorial area possessed by the British in India. Also, who was the first ever Governor General of India? It was William Bentinck. This is very important, remember this. This act also deprived the Governor of Bombay and Madras of their legislative powers. The Governor General of India was given exclusive legislative powers for the entire British India. Can you believe this? The little powers that were left with the governors of Bombay and Madras were also taken away from them. Another important feature of this act that you need to remember is that the laws made under the previous acts were called as regulations, while laws made under this act were called as acts. So in effect, there was a change in nomenclature. Remember, regulations became acts. Under which act? The Charter Act of 1833. Another important feature of this act that you need to remember is that the laws made under the previous acts were called as regulations, while laws made under this act were called as acts. So in effect, there was a change in nomenclature. Remember, regulations became acts. Under which act? The Charter Act of 1833. The Charter Act of 1833 also ended the activities of the East India Company as a commercial body and turned it into a purely administrative body. It provided that the company's territories in India were held by it in trust for His Majesty, his heirs and successors. Remember, in trust. So what was left of the East India Company after being in existence for 233 years in India? It was reduced to a simple administrative body. The British government told them, don't worry, we will look after the trade and commercial affairs too. You just stick to taking care of the administrative affairs from now. The Charter Act of 1833 also attempted to, I repeat, also attempted to introduce a system of open competition for selection of civil servants, and stated that the Indian should not be debarred from holding any place, office or employment under the company. What do we mean by the open competition in this context? The same field that you are aspiring to play in. Yes, it means the CSE, the Civil Services Examination. However, this provision did not go through because it was negated after protests from the lousy Court of Directors. Also, I don't think this bit is mentioned in any of the Lakshmikant editions, but the infamous Macaulay was introduced to the Governor General's Council under this act itself. He was inducted into the council as a law member. We will study more about him going forward, and we will also come across his name frequently when we study modern history. So this was the last of the series of Charter Acts passed by the British Parliament, and it was also a significant constitutional landmark. So the Charter Act of 1853 separated for the first time the legislative and the executive functions of the Governor General's Council. In simple words, there was separation of powers for the first time under this very act. What do we mean by separation of powers? We mean that from 1853 onwards, there were a different set of people under the legislative branch who would focus on the legislative aspects of lawmaking. And there would be another set of people under the executive branch who would focus on implementing the legislations. Earlier, the people who used to create the laws were the same people who implemented them. There was no bifurcation or demarcation of powers. This was the first time in British Indian history that there was a realization that law making is a specialized task. The Charter Act of 1853 also provided for addition of 6 new members to the Legislative Council. They were called the Legislative Councillors. In other words, it established a separate Governor General's Legislative Council, which came to be known as the Indian Central Legislative Council. This legislative wing of the council functioned as a mini parliament, adopting the same procedures as the British Parliament. So we can safely say that this was the birth of the idea of parliamentary system in India. The Indian Central Legislative Council was the precursor to the Parliament of India that we see today. This act also introduced an open competition system of selection and recruitment of civil servants. The covenanted civil services was thus thrown open to Indians also. Remember, we spoke about this earlier while discussing the Charter Act of 1833. The civil services examinations couldn't be open to Indians in 1833 because of the pushback from the Court of Directors of the East India Company, but that changed in 1853. So please remember the timeline of these things. And to implement the policy of opening up of civil services examination, the Macaulay Committee, the Committee on the Indian Civil Service, was appointed in 1854. Are you guys connecting the dots over here? The Charter Act of 1833 also extended the company's administrative rule and allowed it to retain the position of Indian territories on the trust for the British Crown. But this time it did not specify any particular period, unlike the previous charters. This was a clear indication that the company's rule could be terminated at any time the Parliament liked. The Charter Act of 1853 also introduced for the first time, I repeat, for the first time, local representation in the Indian Central Legislative Council. Of the 6 new legislative members of the Governor General's Council, 4 members were appointed by the local, that is provincial governments of Madras, Bombay, Bengal and Agra. But pay attention to this bit. It's not explicitly stated in any of Lakshmikant's editions. Local representation didn't mean native Indians. Local representation meant those Britishers who had settled down in India or had a British lineage. So don't get confused. I came across a question related to this one in one of the test series, so be mindful about these finer details. So with the end of the company's rule from 1773 to 1853, we will wrap up this video here, and I will cover the next part of the same chapter, that is historical underpinnings or historical background, in the next video. Please let me know what you think of these videos, these episodes, in comments below. Tell me if the visuals and this style of explaining things is helping you understand things better. If not, please feel free to dislike this video and help me understand what it is that can be changed and looked into. I look forward to hearing from you all. I'm Sujay Suvarna, and I request you to share this video with your friends and subscribe to the channel, because I promise you that I'm going to try and finish this entire book in this polity series as soon as possible. Thank you.